This morning's scripture text is from Genesis 39. Now Joseph was taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. He was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. He made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and with him there he had no concern for anything but the food that he ate. Now Joseph was handsome and good-looking, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look, with me here my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my hand. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except yourself, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not consent to lie beside her or to be with her. One day, however, when he went into the house to do his work, and while no one else was in the house, she caught hold of his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. When she saw that he left his garment in her hand, she called out to the members of her household and said to them, "See, my husband has brought among us a Hebrew to insult us. He came in here, and I cried out with a loud voice. And when he heard me raise my voice, he left his garment beside me and fled." Then she kept his garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to insult me. But as soon as I raised my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled outside." When his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, saying, "This is the way your servant treated me," he became enraged. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. He remained there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. He gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's care all the prisoners who were in prison, and whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The chief jailer paid no heed to anything that was in Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it to prosper. Years ago, many years ago, before I was a shy, quiet high school student, yet years after I was at absolute holy terror on wheels as a toddler, my younger sister and I would find rather creative ways to entertain ourselves. We lived in the middle of nowhere, had few people to play with, and little resources, so we kind of looked at household items a little differently. And one of these days, we happened to look at a couch pillow, a round couch pillow, and said, "That can be a Frisbee." So we took this Frisbee and made up this game, kind of a combination between baseball and Frisbee. You throw the Frisbee, and then you run to these different spots to get home, or whatever it may be. We lived on 40 acres of land. You can easily choose this oak tree is first base, that maple tree is second base, the birch tree is third base, this stone is home. No, we decided to stay in the house, in the living room, which, as many living rooms are, filled with knickknacks. And on the archway ledge, Mom had a set of ceramic kittens. And I threw the Frisbee. I'm not an athlete. that frisbee hit one of those kittens. It shattered all over the hardwood floor. I was mortified and immediately started to blame the cats. We have multiple cats. The cats walked up, batted it off. My sister said, if we tell the truth, we're not going to get in trouble for lying. And let's face it, Mom and Dad are going to find out if we lie. So we told the truth. And we got in trouble. Had to do probably some extra chores, but just kind of a reminder, you don't play these types of games in the household when there's knickknacks around. And I tell this story because it's so very different than the Bible story. Did something and got in trouble for it, rightly so. In today's story, Joseph did the right thing. Mrs. Potiphar lies, and Joseph ends up in prison. Now, I'm going to get us kind of to where we are today. Last week, Pastor Pat talked about Abram and Sarai, and there's a lot that happens in Genesis between that story and today's story. But to just get up a little bit as to Joseph. Joseph was the beloved. He was the youngest. And his father did not hide the fact that he was the favorite. And his brothers were quite jealous of this. His brothers took him and threw him in this pit. They walked away, and when they came back, Joseph was gone. They were mortified. They went back to their dad and said, Joseph was killed by an animal. And what actually happened was Joseph was rescued by some travelers who went to Egypt. And I say rescued in quotes because these Ishmaelites, these travelers, took Joseph and sold him to be a slave to Potiphar. So Joseph is in this foreign land. He has no family with him. In fact, his family had betrayed him. He's with people that worship many gods. He's a slave. Yet we read that God was present in Joseph's life. In this story, we're told of 4 different times that God was with Joseph. But I can imagine when Joseph was first in prison, he may have been calling out, God, where are you? After all, his life was great. He was the beloved child. And before he was in prison, he was the head honcho of the household. Everybody reported to him. And then Potiphar, who gave him all these duties, throws him in jail. Earlier last week, had a conversation with a friend, and she asked me if I believe in a personal God. And I asked her to explain that a little bit, and she said, she says, yeah, I'm not very religious, but I'm spiritual. I said, okay. And she said, and I pray, and I believe in God, but I always think that there's just kind of this one-way dialogue. Like God doesn't answer my prayers or my calls. And I can imagine maybe that's how Joseph felt when he was first in prison. He was falsely accused. Yet an interesting part of the story is the fact that Joseph was imprisoned. He wasn't killed. And I bring that up because if we read ahead to Exodus 2, spoiler alert here for you guys, we read about a Hebrew, Moses. I think you guys know him. Moses is being sought by Pharaoh. Pharaoh wants to kill Moses because Moses killed an Egyptian. In today's story, Joseph is imprisoned because he allegedly attacked an Egyptian woman of extreme power. Would he not be killed? Was God present in Potiphar's act of mercy and throwing him into prison? Another thing about this story that I find kind of interesting is the fact that there are so many servants who worked with Joseph. Most likely worked very closely with him, knew his character, knew what he was like. Yet we aren't told that they do anything to defend or to stand up for Joseph. They don't even question the allegations from Mrs. Potiphar. Basically, the servants see injustice, wrong, happening, but they don't do anything. And we aren't told why. It's very possible they were scared for their own skin. Mrs. Potiphar is a woman of power. Who knows what she's going to do to them? Today, think of the hundreds, probably the thousands of people who are in our prison system wrongly convicted. People who are convicted because someone lied in order to shorten or eliminate their own sentence. I did a little research, and in the state of Wisconsin, there's this program called Wisconsin Innocent Project. And it's through the University of Wisconsin Law School, and they have a mission which I think is great. It's to educate students, exonerate the innocent, and reform the criminal justice system by identifying and remedying the causes of wrongful convictions. On their website, they have some different stories of people who are incarcerated unjustly, and they go on to explain the very sad reality of how difficult it is once you're in prison to become free. Is a very long, arduous process. A quick summary of a story of someone who, from Wisconsin, was convicted. A person named Shante Ott, in 1995, was convicted of a murder of a teenage runaway. Now, his conviction rested on testimony from two other men who claimed they committed the crime with Ott. One of these men confessed during his third round of questioning by police, yet later is referred to as being a poor historian due to living with cerebral palsy, epilepsy, and brain damage for years. Both of these men pled guilty to lesser charges while Ott stood trial for murder and was convicted by a jury. Ott was probably imprisoned in 96, maybe 97. In 2008, over 10 years later, he was released because DNA test results strongly supported his claim of innocence. The state crime lab found that the male DNA found on the victim in Ott's case matched male DNA found on scenes of two other unsolved murders committed after Ott was in prison, suggesting that it was not Ott who committed this murder. How did Ott survive 10 years in prison? Did he cry out to God? How do you handle being falsely accused? When someone blames you for something you didn't do. Think back to being childhood, having siblings who may have blamed you for the one who broke that knick-knack, who did not do your share of cleaning up the room. Or those of us who have parents who are aging and a sibling suggests that what you're working and trying to do with mom and dad is completely wrong. They need to save every single penny. They can't be going on these vacations. They can't be looking at this nice car, this reliable car, even though we know their financial situation will last them for decades. How do you react when a partner accuses you of cheating, of gambling, of drinking, even though you've been sober for 10 years? What if your boss comes up to you and tells you, there's been an investigation, and evidence points to you embezzling money from this organization? We're not told exactly how Joseph reacted when he was thrown into prison. But 4 times, we read that God is present. In verse 2, when God was present when Joseph was sold to Potiphar. In verse 3, Potiphar recognized God's presence, puts Joseph in charge of the household. In 21, we read that God was present when Joseph was in prison. And in 23, we read the jailer recognized God's presence, just like Potiphar did in verse 3. God is with us. When things are going good, when we are at our lowest, when things are going bad, when things are beyond being bad, things are just crappy and everything is in the toilet. We know it's easy to admit, to recognize, and to say God is with us when things are going good. It's much tougher to recognize God's presence when things are bad. Last week, Pastor Pat talked about the Zion community and how we are called to love and serve, and how it's that simple. Calling to love people and to serve people is that simple. And it's just that hard to love people and to serve people. In the same way, recognizing and standing up for justice is that simple, and it's that hard. Remembering that God is with us, it's very easy when things are flying high, life is going great, and it's that hard. Sometimes it's far harder to even imagine that God is with us when we are falsely accused and when we cry out, God, where are you? And we feel like we are in a one-way dialogue. God is with us. During the good times, those bad times, and the really, really crappy times. Thank God it's not up to us. Thankfully, we have a God that does not pick and choose when to be with us. It just is.